Do you want to stay more focused on the right goals in your life, or even just figure out what the right goals are for you? Do you want clarity? Do you want better work-life balance? Well, you're in the right place. Welcome to Success Through Failure.
Welcome to the Success Through Failure podcast, the show that reveals failure as your path to success. You'll listen to intriguing interviews with some of the most successful people on the planet and learn how their failures became a launchpad for success and how yours can too. Here's your host, former Division I All-American wrestler, former Division I head coach, speaker, and personal coach, Jim Harshaw.
Welcome to another episode of Success Through Failure. Today, I bring you Sam Weinman. There's so many great books out there these days and not enough time to read them all. And if you're like most of my listeners, your time is limited, so you want to get the most out of your reading and not waste time and money on books that just turn out to be duds. That's why I created the Success Through Failure podcast bookstore. My bookstore has links to every book that my guests have recommended so that you can quickly and easily find the books that have influenced some of the highest performers in the world, and they'll have the same impact on your life so that you can move toward the clarity and the focus and the balance that you're looking for and live the life that you've always dreamed of. Just go to jimharshawjr.com/bookstore. That's jimharshawjr.com/bookstore. Sam is the author of Win at Losing: How Our Biggest Setbacks Can Lead to Our Greatest Gains. He's also the digital editor of Golf Digest, a graduate of the University of New Hampshire. He lives with his wife and two sons in Rye, New York, where he coaches multiple youth sports teams. To learn more about Sam, you can check out his website at samweinman.com. And if you're a regular listener to the show, you already know this, but I'm going to put it out there anyway. If you don't have time to listen to this entire episode, or if you hear something you like, make sure you grab the action plan to this episode. It's going to be a couple-page PDF with all the good stuff, all the best quotes and resources from Sam. Just go to jimharshawjr.com/action to get your hands on the action plan from this episode. Sam, welcome to the show.
Oh, thank you for having me, Jim. It's great to be here.
It's great to have you on here. We are kindred souls, I'm pretty sure, with this topic of failure and the value of it. And certainly mine came from my experiences as an athlete and then sort of becoming a father. I'm a father of four and seeing my kids kind of growing up going through this. So we have a lot of good stuff to talk about. So first, Sam, tell us a little bit about your background, where you're from, and what you're doing now.
Yeah, so I'm from Rye, New York. I've been a sports journalist now for about 20 years, and I was, just like a lot of people who are sports journalists, they started out as athletes. I'm still an athlete to an extent, but someone who just, loved sports at a young age and really immersed myself in it. And when it was time to pursue a career, I knew I loved writing, and I loved just everything about being around sports. It just seemed like a natural for me. So that's what I pursued as a career, and I still remain very active in sports, just as an athlete myself, but also coaching my kids. And it's really, not that I like to have my life completely revolve around athletics, but I feel like it's so instructive towards other aspects of my life as well that I really extract a lot of value from it.
Yeah, absolutely. There's so many lessons that we can learn from sports. I don't know that everybody and all coaches, youth coaches, high school, college coaches, I don't know that all of them really do enough of a job of sort of translating what you learn in sports into life, into the real world. And that's exactly what you've done with your book.
Yeah.
Where did this book come from?
Well, it started, I kind of say I had a two-pronged approach to how I came about this topic. One, it was as a writer and as someone who's covered sports, both, at the professional level and collegiate level. And
not just golf too, right? I mean, you've covered Stanley Cups and other things like that?
Yeah, exactly. So before I was at Golf Digest, I covered in newspapers. I was in the Gannett chain for 10 years, and I covered the NHL pretty closely and covered Major League Baseball. And I just feel like I've always been drawn to the losing team. I always feel like those are the more interesting stories, and because I feel like people are more honest and they are more introspective. And so that was one part of it. And the other part of it was just as a dad, just in dealing with my kids and seeing how they approach failure and how they came to let it be something that burdened them in a way that I found to be counterproductive. And knowing in my own mind that losing is such a great opportunity and such a great experience to go through. Not that you enjoy it by any means, but it's so instructive and so helpful in so many ways. I found myself drawn to this idea of what can we learn from people who have lost in profound ways, and what, not only can, my kids who are, ages 11 and 9, but what can adults learn from it, and college graduates, and, every segment of society has something to learn from people who have lost, not only in how they deal with it, but also in sort of the steps they take immediately afterward to somehow profit from the experience.
Yeah, I find it interesting that most people feel like successful people haven't failed, when it's actually the opposite. It's they've failed, but they've overcome it. They've kept moving. They've kept pushing forward, and that's, I think, one of the biggest takeaways. I mean, it hurts so bad though, right? In the moment, failure, I mean, it sucks, right?
Right.
I mean, we watched the Super Bowl and the Falcons have this meltdown. I mean, it's painful, but how do you teach this to your kid? What do you teach your kid? What do you talk to your kids about? Because I know personally, I give this TEDx talk, why I teach my children to fail, but my kids still struggle with it. It's not that I have solved this problem, but I feel like I have some perspective on it that I can provide to them. How do you talk to your kids, and how's that work?
Well, first of all, I think you're absolutely right that it has to hurt. If it doesn't hurt, then it's not real failure. It's not real loss. I mean, if it's something that you just sort of shrug your shoulders at and move on, okay, that's great that you have that ability to, minimize the pain of an event. But my point is that the things we really learn from are the things that really grab our attention, that, grab us by the shoulders and are in some way or another something that we are forced to deal with. And so I think the first thing I tell my boys is this is totally natural. It's totally understandable that you're disappointed by this. And after your, initial hour or day or whatever it is of being crushed by it, we need to now take a step back and see what we can do next. And, in some cases, there are natural lessons that we can learn from these experiences, but sometimes it's just being able to be more resolved to be stronger next time and find a new path that is going to be, more productive. And so I first of all tell them to, recognize this is an opportunity, and you might not see it right now, but at some point fairly soon, you're going to see something that is going to be helpful about this episode.
Interesting. So what you mentioned, that sounds like you kind of give them some time. You don't necessarily handle it in the moment. You let them deal with it for, an hour or a day or whatever the case might be.
Sure.
And then you're able to sort of have some perspective when the emotions sort of run their course for the most part. And then you can gain some perspective and some insight on it.
And that's the natural word, Jim, I was going to say, is emotion is such a big part of it. And you have to get to a point where you're separating emotion from reason, because we all have these, emotional reactions to events. And, sometimes that part has to pass first before you can look at it more logically.
Yeah. Yeah, no question. I mean, I look back at my experience as an athlete, and I mean, the pain of the losses, you didn't want to hear anything about how this is going to be beneficial or how this is going to help you when you're in the moment. But after you gain some perspective, you're a little more open to learning about that. And it's the same in the real world, whether we're trying to get a promotion or start a business or fix a broken relationship or lose 20 pounds or whatever the case might be in the real world. For the listener, it's the same thing. You're going to experience the failure. It's just a matter of, dealing with it for a little bit and then trying to pull back and gain some perspective. And that's why I'm a big proponent of having a personal coach or having a mastermind group or having other people in your life that can help you gain that perspective, because it's sometimes hard, if not impossible, to do ourselves. And I feel like, Sam, that's one of the roles that your book plays in society now is you are sharing stories of
Sure.
people who who have been on top of the podium, the people that we know
Sure.
that are just uber successful. And you're going, hey, no, look, like these guys, they failed too. And,
Sure.
and here's their story, the part that we don't know, the pain and suffering part, right? And so you relate this. So any sort of favorite stories, maybe, can you share us with maybe, I don't know, 2 or 3 of your favorite stories from the book?
Sure. I mean, they're all, of course I'm biased, but they're all pretty instructive. I mean, certainly when you talk about that experience of being on top of the world and thinking that, it just came easy. I think of the story of Dan Jansen, which is the speed skater. I'm sure you've heard. I certainly knew parts of it before I started reporting the book, but, Dan Jansen was this speed skater who, in the end won the gold medal in 1994 and set a world record. But before that, he had fallen in a series of Olympic races. And the most heartbreaking of those episodes was in 1988. His 500-meter race, which he was favored to win, he fell in the race, and it came just hours after his sister had died of leukemia, and it was just heartbreaking. And then he, 2 days later, he was set to race again, and he dedicated the race to his sister. And we're thinking it's going to be this triumphant win, and he falls in that race as well.
Wow.
And really, in some ways, seemed like this was going to be this episode that was going to define him. And sure enough, 4 years later, he's back in the Olympics, favored to win, loses again. And what was interesting about him was the process he went through in wrapping his head around those experiences. First, in allowing himself to kind of forgive himself for messing up in the way that he did, because certainly a big part of when we look at losing is like beating ourselves up for it. And with the work of a sports psychologist, he got to this point where he recognized that some of these things were outside of his control, which was a huge part of it, was recognizing the things that we don't necessarily have a say in, and then was looking at, okay, what can I do better? What am I missing about my approach right now? And a lot of what he did over the subsequent years was looking at his approach to the 1,000-meter race, which he hated, and learning to embrace it and learning to embrace the process of training as opposed to being focused on just the results, which was hugely important. And so all of these sort of steps he took along the way were instructive in getting him to a place where he was just basically in a better, stronger peace of mind to race. And, in his final Olympic race, he had sort of decided, regardless of what happens, I'm going to be content with what I did. He won the Olympic gold medal. So it's a really, really inspirational story, especially when you consider the depths he experienced. And so that's certainly one. And then I talked about, you talk about guys who only knew success. Well, one of my favorite chapters in the book is about the Columbia University football team in the late 80s who lost 44 straight games in college. And what's interesting is that none of those guys went on to play in the NFL or had any sort of redeeming moment in football, but all of them went on to be really successful people just in life. And, on Wall Street and as doctors and in law, and to a man, they all point to the experience they had with losing in football and the pain they suffered and sort of this hollow feeling they left college with, and how it fed this fire that they had to prove themselves in other ways. And so they talk about how this really difficult experience was instructive, and how they cope with disappointment, and how they kind of left college with something to prove. And it's it's another way of looking at how people get successful. It's not just because they learn how to win. It's also because they learn how to cope with setbacks and push through them. So I find that to be a very inspirational story as well.
Yeah, that's an interesting one. Do you feel, Sam, like people can go the other direction? They lose and lose and lose, and maybe they aren't able to gain that perspective, and they think they're a loser, and they go through life as a loser because that's sort of the story they've told themselves? Yeah,
absolutely. And then that's a really important point to make, is that everything that happens to us is subject to our interpretation. And so if you want to go down that road in which you say, well, it's clear I'm just a loser, I can't do anything right, and this is just going to the fate I am sealed to. Well, yes, you can absolutely talk yourself into that corner. And, the sort of consistent thread of the people that I profile in the book is at some point, not always right away, and sometimes years later, they get to a point where they recognize that they don't need to think that way, and that there is something they can do about their situation. And whether it's through sheer force of will or through the help of other people or circumstances, they eventually sort of emerge from that way of thinking and get to that place where they realize that losing experience is something that's only going to make them stronger.
That's interesting. There's a guest that I had on, and for the listener, you can check this out. It's episode 52 with Travis Macy. He's an author and ultra marathon or ultra distance athlete. Mm-hmm. And he talks about in his book and part of his when he speaking and in his course, he talks about this story that we tell ourselves, right? We have this story. And I remember first time sort of hearing people say, well, you have this story you tell yourself. Well, I'm not telling myself any story. Like there's no, I don't have like story time with myself, every night before I go to bed. But there's this sort of underlying, feeling and subconscious self-talk that we have about our past. And some of it may be good, some of it may be bad, but like you can actually take control of that story. I mean, you have to actually bring it to the surface first.
Right.
And go and look at it objectively, like you said, with reason and logic as opposed to emotion, and go, okay, so I experienced this. Mm-hmm. I lost 44, as a team, we lost 44 straight times. So I'm a loser. Or I can go, okay, so what did I learn from that? I learned, resilience and persistence and hard work and work ethic and teamwork and all these other things, So these are the values that I have from that experience. Or you can say, I suck and I'm no good and
exactly.
and die homeless, penniless, and 20 pounds overweight, as Stuart Smalley would say on Saturday Night Live. So, so what sets these people apart? Like the Dan Janssens or I've heard you talk about Michael Dukakis, who lost, a politician, Greg Norman, and I mean, what sets them apart? Is it something just innate is it just kind of part of their DNA? And if that's the case, what, do I have no, for the listener and myself, do we have no choice but to sort of go, okay, well, it's not up to me, but, or are there things that we can do? I mean, they're sort of habits or actions that you've seen some of these folks take that help them achieve success despite failure. Or
there's
because of it.
Yeah. There's a lot of debate about how much of this is innate. And I think the answer to that part is that certainly some people are more inherently optimistic or resilient than other people, which is not to say that you can't become more optimistic or become more resilient. And it's sort of, and I say this in the book in a very meta way, like one of our constant struggles is how we deal with struggle. And if you learn how to look at challenges in a more philosophical way and look at it as something that you can control and not have it define you, that's the most important step. So I'm sure along the way you've talked about growth mindsets and fixed mindsets, and that really is the consistent thread with all of these people, is that they all at some point display this growth mindset in which they embrace challenge. They understand it as something that is inevitable and is something that they need to face head on, and that they can work toward and work toward overcoming, as opposed to letting it overwhelm them. And so a lot of it is sort of this, like you said, this self-talk that we go to, what we do, which is that when we are met with some type of resistance, rather than say, I'm obviously, I can't get anything right here. It's okay. This is something that I need to get past. So what are the opportunities that are here that I can identify and build upon? And so it's the consistent thread is looking at challenge as an opportunity and going from there.
and you mentioned earlier about the value of athletics, and I just I look back at my life and just the people that I was surrounded by, and we talk about, is this DNA, is this built in, or some people are just more optimistic, and I definitely think that's part of it. And I think luckily for me and for a lot of folks who have been in athletics, you get to be surrounded by amazing people. I went to like summer camps, and I go to clinics, and I try to find the best coaches, and my dad and mom would help me try to find the best coaches to be around. Right. And when you're around these people, they fill your head with sort of different things, right? Like positive things and ways to think about things. And they teach you how to think about success and failure. And so the more that sort of fed into you at a young age, I think that's a really important part of it. Jim Rohn, the late, motivational speaker, his sort of famous quote that's attributed to him is, "You are the average of the 5 people that you spend the most time with." And I think about that. To be honest, I live with my wife, 2 daughters, and 2 sons. So 3 women and 2. So I would be like I guess that makes me, and my average would be like a teenage girl, apparently. So I think it's bigger than that, right? Because it's the content that you fill your mind with, and whether you're reading books like yours, I think that's so important to read a book reading a book about winning at losing and how other people have failed and still achieve success, either because of that or despite that, however you want to look at it. But it's part of this, what I call environment of excellence that we have and that elite athletes have. Dan Jansen had a sports psychologist who in part helped him through this ridiculous, insanely difficult time. And so I think for the listener, you've got to really cultivate that environment around you, whether it's, the people you're surrounding yourself with, the content that you read, the books that you read, the podcasts you listen to, et cetera. I think that's a really important thing that we can learn from sports.
Well, you make a couple of excellent points. One, of course, is I do feel like experience, and certainly sports provides that experience, like experience with failure is inevitably a very good thing because it's something you draw upon, which is like, I have lost before and it really hurt. And you know what? I survived. And in some form or another, it ended up helping me. And so that's a really good point too. And inherently, unless you are, the way top of the pyramid as an athlete, you are going to experience your share of defeat and challenges. So that's really helpful. The other thing is, you talked about, which is kind of what you're surrounding yourself with. And I do think that, there have been studies done about the science of resilience, like what makes people resilient. And they talk about, cognitive health, like how healthy, like you're just a healthier brain, and that's, physical fitness is a part of it. The sort of, a certain amount of spirituality that you have, the role model, positive role models you mentioned, that's another really part thing. Like, these are actual ingredients that goes toward resilience.
Interesting.
There's a couple of psychologists, Stephen Southwick and Dennis Charney, who have written about this, and I quote them in the book, and they talk a lot about sort of there are actual factors that play into how we can develop resilience. And you'll notice that all of those things are things that we can control. Like, obviously you might not be the most physically fit person, but you can become physically fitter. You can have cognitive health by, like you said, exposing yourself to books and podcasts and, content and talking to people. So that's things that's a muscle that you can develop, and spirituality, something you can find. These are all things that, yes, some people have natural advantages in those areas, but these are all areas that you can cultivate. And so that really sort of fortifies you for the challenges that we're going to face.
Yeah. That's interesting. One thing you mentioned was sort of identifying these past instances of failure and how they've resulted in, positive outcomes. Mm-hmm. And it's interesting. So my wife is a licensed therapist. Mm-hmm. And so we're big proponents, and I've worked with sports psychologists through my wrestling career. So I'm a big proponent of having mental coaches and psychologists and counselors and therapists. Sure. I'm a big proponent of it. I think everybody can get more out of that. I'm working with one of the highest sort of performers that I know, that I personally know in my life. He's hired me recently to coach him, and this guy's like killing it at every level, at everything he does. He's like, Jim, I need a coach. I need you to coach me. I'm like, all right. So, but it's interesting. So you talk about identifying the past. Well, I was working with my wife and I went and saw a therapist for our kids, and she's sort of like a parent coach, and she's amazing. But what this lady said is, when my one son was going through a struggle for a while, and she's like, well, remind him when he's going through something like this, ask him how he feels from a 1 to a 10. And he would always say he's at a 10, and when he's in the moment. Right. And then after he would calm down, day later, that day or the day later, we would say, okay, so you were at a 10. And now how do you feel? 1 to 10. He's like, well, a 0 or a 1, he's back to normal. And so that whenever he gets back to that moment, the next time this happens and he feels like it's never going to go away, this bad feeling, we go, okay, so you remember that last time you were at a 10, did that? And then it went away. So it's like, it's exactly what you just said. I mean, that's like from a professional opinion, it's like you identify the past and apply it to the present. And it's so helpful, whether it's for parenting or sports or for us in the real world.
Absolutely. I mean, it's like this bank of experience that we can draw on. And so, once you say, oh, I've been through this once before and it was okay. I got out of it. That's very, it's a powerful and somewhat liberating feeling, because once you recognize that, there is a pathway out of these dark moments, you are that much more proactive in trying to find it.
All right, Sam, this is the part of the show where I turn the question on you. So I've shared with the audience, I've shared my failures before. Certainly, I made very public my failure as a wrestler, which eventually led to success. I've talked about my failure as a business person, as a father, and health and fitness, and every other area of my life. And so I think it's important to share those because we all go through this. So has there been a time in your life or an experience where you failed and maybe failed significantly, and as a result you felt that hopelessness, that overwhelming self-doubt, but you were able to overcome it and achieve, like I said, either despite it or because of it?
Yeah. I mean, I would be dishonest if I limited it to just one, but I will give you one, which was that I've talked about is when I grew up playing hockey, and I still play, and I coach my kids in hockey. So I love the sport, and it means so much to me. And when I was in high school, I was on a pretty good high school team, and we were in the state quarterfinals, and we were down a goal, and we were looking to kind of tie the score up. Anyway, I made a pass to what I thought was a teammate, and ended up being to the other team. And that puck ended up in the back of our net, and we ended up losing by a goal. Ouch. And so I was in tears after the game, and I walked out into the parking lot, and I was a junior in high school, and I remember my mom talking about remember we were just talking earlier about emotion and logic, and I took my varsity jacket off, and I threw it into this muddy puddle, and I got onto the bus. And it was kind of my way of saying, I'm done with hockey. I can't, it's so heartbreaking to me. I don't want to deal with it anymore. And it was a really difficult time for me, because basically it ended our season, first of all, and it felt like my fault. And it was, I had a hard time seeing how there could be any upside to it. Well, you have a whole off season to think about how your season ended. And in my case, I had an off season to think about a mistake I made and what I was going to do about it. And, it's a small thing. I never went on to play at any really high level in hockey, but, I went into my senior year really motivated, like ridiculously motivated to, put that behind me and grow from the experience. And I recognized, I wasn't in as good a shape. Like when you're not as fit, especially in hockey, you make mental errors. And in that case, I was probably not as physically fit as I should have been. And as a result, it led to a really bad mental error, which cost us in a big spot. So I really
a learning experience.
So I really devoted myself to my fitness. I certainly had a little bit of a chip on my shoulder because I did not want that one thing to define me. And I had a great senior year, like a much better senior year. And I would not have gotten to that point as a hockey player. And I got to play a little bit in college after that. I would not have gotten to that point had I just had like an okay end of the season and kind of everything, because I wouldn't have had that sort of moment of truth where I had to really recognize something I was doing wrong. So small thing, it's sports, but it was really instructive just as a person about how you can take a negative outcome and really turn it into a positive.
Yeah, that's great. And I think for the listeners, you've got to realize what's the What's the experience that you have in your past? Maybe it was last week, maybe it was last year, maybe it was 10 or 20 years ago, where you failed and you tried something and you failed. And how can you look at that now and go, okay, I'm better off now for it? Or if nothing else, you can say, okay, well, I learned one way not to do it.
Right.
You know, and so I urge the listeners really to consider that, to think about that, think about the obstacle that's holding them, the psychological obstacle that's holding you back right now. That little part of you that says, yeah, that'd be cool to try, but I can't do that. Yeah.
You make a really good point. Not to interrupt you. When you just said, I learned what not to do. There's a sports psychologist by the name of Fran Turizzolo, who you may know. Anyway, he is a huge proponent of what you just mentioned, which is this, not this, but that. In order to kind of understand the things that are going to make you successful, you have to have a clear understanding of the things you shouldn't do or can't do. And he talks about in the golf context, like the feel of what a slice feels like. So to know that feel is to now know what you want to avoid. And
Sure.
So it's a really instructive thing. So when we talk about failures or bad outcomes and what good can come from them, well, one thing we're learning, like you said, is we are learning about what not to do.
Sam, if you had one opportunity to go back in time and talk to your 20-year-old self, and you were sitting across the table looking eye to eye at your 20-year-old self, what would you say to yourself?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I just remember when I was 20. I mean, it's weird because I'm certainly happy with the way my life has turned out, and but I remember when I was 20, I was really just anxious about everything and apprehensive about my career and of being on my own, and certainly, like who I was going to end up with my as a wife and all those things. And so I would tell myself that there is that only good things come from risk and putting yourself out there, and that whatever your failures are, and I had a few, as a professional and whatnot, whatever those failures are, they are going to be they're going to be helpful. And so the more you can sort of wrap your brain around the idea that messing up is going to actually be good for you, the less encumbered by fear you should be. And so I guess it would be a more general message of don't be afraid to mess up, because you're going to, and ultimately it's going to help you.
Yeah, great message, Sam. I want you to recommend another book outside of your own, which your own book, again, for the listeners, is Win at Losing: How Our Biggest Setbacks Can Lead to Our Greatest Gains. Amazing book. Can you recommend another book or two that are favorites of yours?
Sure. I mean, there's a gajillion, but since we're talking about that topic, I mean, if you haven't read Carol Dweck's book called Mindset, about growth mindsets and fixed mindsets, it's really I think the most important book on this topic, because it really drills down into everything we've just talked about, and about how we get to choose how we think about things and how we approach problems. And it's applicable to dealing with our kids, and it's applicable to dealing with just our own challenges. And she has examples from education, but also business and athletics, and so that's certainly I would definitely recommend that. And then I don't know, I'm just thinking about what I've been reading recently. I just finished Hillbilly Elegy, which is fantastic. And the thing that's interesting about that is that's it's not really talking about the world of failure, but it's a really interesting book about J.D. Vance, who grows up in rural Kentucky and rural Ohio, and he came from a very difficult background. And ultimately, what we can learn from that is that here's a guy who had every sort of disadvantage about, like, a broken home and his mom was all over the place. You'd think that would be a really crippling experience, but it also taught him, like we mentioned, amazing resilience and the skills of persistence. And it gave him this great appreciation for the value of hard work in pulling himself out of a pretty rough spot. And so when we look at the challenges we face, we should take some solace in the fact that that's ultimately going to make you stronger, which is one of the messages I got from that book.
Excellent. And for the listener, I will have links to both of the books that he just recommended, as well as Sam's book, and I'll have those in the action plan. So go to jimharshawjr.com/action action. Sam, can you take a minute and just kind of promote yourself a little bit? Tell us where we can find you, follow you, etc.
Well, thank you for the opportunity. My book is called Win at Losing, How Our Biggest Setbacks Can Lead to Our Greatest Gains. It's available on all the major platforms and hopefully at your local bookstore as well. And there's a lot of information about me and my book at samweinman.com. That's my website. And you can certainly follow me on Twitter as well at samweinman as well.
All right. And again, for the listener, I'll have links to his website, Twitter, etc. in the action plan. Sam, thanks so much for making time to come on the show.
Oh, it's my pleasure, Jim. Thank you.
Yeah. And for the listener, until next time, take the time to get clear on your goals and embrace failure as a stepping stone on your path to success.